All right, welcome back to the channel. What a treat last night, I cannot lie. Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. go to war, man, and what I thought was a very exciting fight. But most importantly, they proved exactly why we do not need sanctioning bodies in boxing. They are taking these fighters' money and they don't serve 3% worth of their purse. Not that type of service. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So, last night, begrudgingly watched a pay-per-view card. Well, actually, I just watched the pay-per-view fight. I didn't watch any of the other fights. I just watched Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. And the reason that I did not watch the rest of the fights is because I was just fundamentally, morally, ethically opposed to this fight. Because these are two guys who are going to get a lot of the spotlight because of their names and because of what people thought about them when they were in the primes and after the prime of their career. And then I thought for a second, before I decided, when I was like, man, I'm not going to watch this fight. Then I thought, man, you're nuts. When's the next time you're going to be able to see Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones? When are you going to be able to see Mike Tyson in a boxing ring again? Like, you've not seen him in the ring. You were a huge fan of him. When are you ever going to see Mike Tyson in the ring again? So I said, I don't know when I'm going to see him in the ring again. I'm going to watch him in this one. Roy Jones Jr., the same thing, man. And it was the nostalgia, right? From all of the fights that I've seen with Mike Tyson, all of the fights I saw with Roy Jones that I was excited about, that we had fight parties about, all of that nostalgia came back, and I thought to myself, let me watch this fight. So I watched the fight, and I was very, very satisfied with what I saw, and on a lot of different levels. First and foremost, there were a lot of people really excited about boxing. And that is a very, very good feeling for me, somebody that really, as you know, because you guys that follow the channel know, I'm an advocate for fighters. I'm an advocate for black fighters in the United States specifically, because I don't care what anybody says, those fighters get the shaft on on average, much more than anybody else does. And they have such an incredible amount of talent that is not featured, that is not talked about, and is not given the exposure that it should be given, while the same people that aren't given this exposure give that exposure to fighters that people are not interested in the United States. But yet they being people like Ring Magazine and ESPN are desperately trying to make you interested in. But it will never work. Now, why do I say that? Because it didn't work with Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. They weren't trying to put at the second half of Mike Tyson's career. The media and all those guys treated Mike Tyson terribly. Roy Jones Jr., when he was on HBO, they talked about him in the fights he had terribly. All the while, boxing fans from the United States are tuning out what the media people are saying and watching Mike Tyson, watching Roy Jones Jr., and having an excellent time, man, watching these fights. And to have them come back and give us an opportunity to see that again, man, the shame of the matter is that might be the best fight of this year. Like, besides the Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury fight, which is now just, embroiled in a bunch of cheating nonsense because people are like, hold on, let's go back and look at this tape again. Dang, Tyson Fury was cheating his tail off. Well, guess Deontay Wilder's not the greatest fighter in the world, and I guess Tyson Fury's a cheater. So, hey, what's next, right? That's what that debacle turned into. But you got Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson, and people are like, who you think is going to win? Do you think Mike's going to knock him out? Roy's too small for him. Real conversations going on in my ear amongst people about this fight. And the whole time I'm thinking, do they not know that these guys are older than me? Like, I told my son, like, my wife was like, so are you watching the Mike Tyson, Roy Jones Jr. fight? And I was like, man, I don't know, man. These dudes are older than me. And my son was like, they're not older than you. Like, yeah, they are older than me. One is 54 and the other one is 50. The other one's 51, about to turn 52 in January. But they didn't care, right? They didn't care because the names carried something, right? Because of the memories from the fights in the past. But we don't have that now. And this is where I'm saying, like, it's the sad part about it, right, is you have a guy like Roy Jones Jr. You can say what you want about Roy Jones Jr., but he is one of the most talented and best fighters of my lifetime, for sure. Of all of the great fighters that I know in my lifetime, right, that I've seen in my lifetime, like Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Leonard, Thomas Hearns, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Andre Ward, Roy Jones Jr., Floyd Mayweather Jr., these guys are Tyson, right? These guys, that's what they bring to the table, man. But do we have that today? And will the fighters, will the people who are now coming up at the same time as Errol Spence Jr., coming up at the same time as Terrence Crawford, are they going to get that fight? Are they going to be able to get, like, later down the road, like, oh, well, this fantasy matchup finally happens between Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford, right? Are we going to, you know why? And my answer to that is no, because they were never allowed to get big enough right now. This is the problem in boxing. We're going to talk about the two problems. One is this treatment of black American fighters. Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson are black American fighters. I say that like, because sometimes people got to get that through their head. They want to, oh no, Mike Tyson's global. Roy Jones global. No, Mike Tyson is from New York. Roy Jones is from Florida. Roy Jones was born in 1969, 2 months before I was born. He was in the same Olympic Games that I was training for in track and field, but he's just a way better athlete and made it, right? But that's my contemporary. Mike Tyson, when he was 19 years old and came out on Sports Illustrated, which you will never see now. You will never see a young black dude like that, 19 years old, get put on the cover of Sports Illustrated from a knockout streak and be built like Mike Tyson was built. Why? Because with people like Paulie Malignaggi are saying, well, the Eastern Europeans are dominating boxing, so I guess that's what we need to focus on, right? I remember back in the 1980s and the 1990s when black fighters were actually decent. You know, maybe I think he might have said sometimes maybe in the 80s a little bit, sometimes in the 90s, black fighters were kind of decent. But now the Eastern European is dominating. That's the attitude. And I don't care what people say, that Paulie Malignaggi is not alone in that thought, even though it's ridiculous, right? Because what Eastern European champions are there? All of the entire Ukraine lost their belts. They have no champions over there. Not Vasily Lomachenko, not Wojciech, not Alexander Usyk. Zero. But yet and still, somehow the story is sold that they're dominating boxing. But while Bob Arum, ESPN, Steve Kim, all these guys, Dan Rayfield, are all in the midst of trying to sell you these Eastern Europeans, there is a Mike Tyson, man, running around, man. There's a guy named Jared Anderson. Dude, that might be Jared Anderson, might be the Mike Tyson type of dude. Not necessarily the same style, but anybody talking about him, giving him a lot of no, right? Roy Jones Jr. We've got multiple guys that are fighting right now that are that may not be as good as Roy Jones Jr., but man, Terrence Crawford is very similar to Roy Jones Jr. in a lot of regards, man, with his athleticism and his talent. Is he being put to the forefront like Roy Jones Jr. forced himself to the forefront with HBO? No, they're not. So when time goes on, we are more than likely not going to be able to have these type of things because our fighters are not being developed and not being promoted. Well, they're being developed, but not being promoted like they were when Mike Tyson was able to be promoted by Don King, when there were really big fights that could be made like Roy Jones Jr. versus James Toney, Roy Jones Jr. versus Bernard Hopkins, Roy Jones Jr. versus Tarver, right? All of those fights were big fights that were promoted, but not now. Those type of fights, you're gonna see a lot less of them. But the last thing that this fight also proved is if they made all this money for charity by putting on a pay-per-view event with these two legends, why do regular boxers with that type of name recognition need sanctioning bodies? For what? Why don't you just fight? Don't have a belt. Have everybody tune in and be like, man, I can't wait to see what belt's on the line, man. Ain't no belt on the line. These dudes just going to be fighting each other and get Snoop Dogg to cover the fight. That would be helpful too. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. I mean, I really can't talk too much about the fight itself. You know, I think it's a draw. I mean, the draw was cool. Both fighters looked like they were trying to hurt each other, man. So it was a good, exciting fight. I liked it. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what yours is. And with that, I'm out. Peace.